I should come over and stand behind my friend Jim Squires because we're being recorded. And if I don't stand here, they won't pick up my voice. But I want to welcome all of you here. This is the first meeting of what we call the Writers Circle. Will Akers and I came to the library a few months ago and said we really think it would be helpful if you gave all the people who are interested in writing in Nashville an opportunity to sit in a room and listen to two great authors. And so we're going to do this every quarter. We're going to come together, and we have Jim Squires today and Madison Smartt today. And each quarter there will be a meeting like this. We hope you'll come back. We hope you'll consider yourselves, as of today, members of the Writers Circle. And I really have been amazed over 40 years, believe it or not. I have done a television show called A Word on Words, which is a book review program. Madison Smartt has been on it at least a dozen times. He says 100 times.
Don has been very good to me.
But every time he writes a book, I see if I can get him on, and I've been very, very lucky. But it's been novel after novel after novel. And then the wonderful trilogy on Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary who sort of changed the hemisphere for a period. And it's just such a pleasure for me to be here today with all of you, but particularly with Will and Madison and Jim, all of whom have appeared on A Word on Words. These are three really gifted writers, and I'm so happy they both accepted. I don't think you ever met before today, did you?
No, we have not.
But we're having a good time so far.
Already.
But they're having a good time so far. And having all of you here, I think, really makes it more of a joy for them and certainly for Will and for me. I guess I should just touch very briefly on some of the books they've written. I should mention it because in one case Jim and I co-authored a book. I guess that was your first book.
It was.
And it was mine too. But it was a book called A Search for Justice. And Jim was a reporter at the Tennessean at that time, and I was the editor of the Tennessean, and he and two other reporters on separate assignments went out and covered 3 assassination trials that took place same year in about a 7-month period. And it got very good reviews in the Tennessean because all 4 of us worked for the Tennessean. And that book was the first time I ever interviewed authors for A Word on Words. 40 years now I've done it, and Squires, you started this, and I'm thankful to you for it. Jim graduated from Vanderbilt when it was Peabody. He graduated from Peabody before it was part of Vanderbilt, but it is now. He went off to Harvard for a Nieman Fellowship, and then he became the editor of Orlando Sentinel, and then he was editor of the Chicago Tribune. But he's here today not because he's a journalist, but because he's he's written these books, and I just tell you briefly about, I won't tell you about them, I'll just give you a brief rundown. After Search for Justice, Jim did a book called Read All About It. It was a story that was reflected the takeover of American newspapers by corporations. Then came the sequel, The Secrets of the Hopewell Box, which you'll hear a good deal about, I hope, today. It's a story grounded in fact in this community. His family played a role in it, he played a role in it. He also, he raises horses in Lexington, Kentucky since he's retired. And he rode Horse of a Different Color. Then he wrote Headless Horseman. But he doesn't have a fixation on horses or on journalism. He's writing a sequel to The Secrets to the Hopewell Box. And he's also, and that's a book called Mink's Lie. And I've read it, and it's terrific. He says it needs a publisher, and I'll tell you, it's going to get one. And so, Jim, we're grateful to you for coming from Lexington today, and thank you very much. Now, Madison has come from Maryland to New York.
New York this time.
You live in Maryland, but you're living right now in New York.
That's it.
And you went to Princeton.
I did.
And then you wrote book after book after book after book after book after book. 13 novels before the trilogy on Tucson. And I really believe that we've had a half hour together on virtually every book you've written.
I think so.
Starting with Washington Square Ensemble, I can remember Save Me Joe Louis. I remember Straight Cut. I don't want to forget any, so I'll stop right there. But
That's
they go
good.
on and on and on, and they are wonderful. And today, Jim has read your book, and you've read his book. And this is your latest. We did this book on a word when?
Last summer, I think.
Yeah, last summer, and it's called The Color of Night. And they're not only gifted, they also have this great ability to write to a change of pace. They can focus on history, they can focus on politics, they can focus on the real world, they can write it with the deepest seriousness and then with great humor. And then, really the founder of this program, Will Akers, is going to interview the two of them today. And Will is a teacher. He's taught film. His passion is film. And for 18 years, I was going to say 20 years, but I think it's 18. For 18 years, he's taught film at Vanderbilt, and I'm just going to make an announcement. He is very soon going to start the new film program at Belmont University, and they're excited about it, and I'm excited about it. I'm sure there are tears at Vanderbilt. Maybe not, but there should be if they're not. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Will. He's a lifetime member of the Writers Guild of America. A distinguished writer in his own right. He wrote a book on how to write. And on how to be a playwright. And I read it, and I think I could do it if I just followed closely everything he said. And so I know there are some authors here today. I recognize your faces. What an honor it is to have you here. I won't begin singling you out. I know there are some would-be authors here who are going to be authors. And with that, Will, I turn the program
Thank you very
over
much.
to you and
Thank-
my two good
I'm
friends.
touching the red button, yeah.
And they saved
No,
an
don't.
easy chair
Did you
over here
press
for
it?
me. I don't know if you noticed that, but I'm going to take
Yeah.
advantage of it.
There we go. Press it twice. Okay, everybody's got the handout. First page of the handout is, I believe, from Madison's book, which is the one that says Madison Smartt Bell at the top. And they've each read each other's complete book, and you've all got the first couple of pages of the two books. And so each author is going to talk about the other guy's first couple of pages. So Jim, if you'll lead off and tell us about Madison's pages in the color and all.
I will. You know, there needs to be a caveat or two. Back in biblical times, when an ass spoke, it was considered to be a miraculous work of Almighty God. But today is different. You know, you can hear one talking any hour of the day and night on radio, television, or somewhere from out in cyberspace. And every now and then, one will show up at a wonderful venue like this and speak forever about things about which he does not have a clue. And you might be about to experience that. When Will invited me to do this, I accepted not because I thought I could teach anybody anything about writing, but because I knew if I got in a group like this, I would learn something. And so I came here to learn, and I've never given up hope that I can learn. But driving down here today from Lexington, it occurred to me that Will has balanced this panel perfectly between the top of the writer's food chain and the bottom. And so you're going to see a dramatic contrast, and there's no question where I am in this pecking order. This format that we could read each other's books was daunting to me because I am incapable of critiquing a writer of the quality and esteem of Madison Bell. Most of my stuff has been journalism. I love writing. I've been trying to get better as the years go by, and that means I've had plenty of years to work on it. But this book, my book that he's going to talk about, is really a simple and somewhat personal piece of political history. His, on the other hand, is a piece of fiction that is, I believe, to be a tour de force by one of the most competent and celebrated novelists in the country. So I have a harder job than he does. I've reviewed a lot of books for the New York Times, LA Times, a few magazines, but they don't ask me to review great fiction by great writers. I have read enough, however, to know that this book is not your normal classic novel in structure or tone. It is a bold departure in many ways. One of the most striking being that it does not contain a single character who has the traditional appeal. Usually in almost every book there's some character you can love. And I don't think you're going to find one in this. Certainly not if you look at it from just a traditional reader's point of view. There's hardly anyone admirable. This would be considered a flaw if I wrote this and tried to send it in. But when it is written by someone with this kind of talent, and you see a protagonist who is so abused and pathetic and pitiful that your heart actually goes out to where he has in fact accomplished the mission of having an admirable character. And few writers, I think, could even conjure up, much less develop, a character like this female Vegas blackjack dealer May. I've never encountered one quite like it before. I mean, I don't know how you come to actually feel sorry for a drug-addicted, perverted, demented murderer. It's very difficult to do, but some writers are talented enough to bring you there. And I would just like to go through a few of these sentences on these first 2 or 3 pages. The best I can do is point out to you some of the gifts of a great writer, how he can get you into a book, and demand that you keep reading. And I will use my own experience as an example. I mean, just look at the first paragraph. There's a word in there that threw me right off. what you would think at first glance is a soughing voice, ghost voice. Well, that is south, but rhymes with bow, right? You think that might be bow, but it is not. I mean, at least in one of my courses, I learned a little bit about the derivation of language. That is a Middle English word, an old medieval word, which basically means a whirring, soft, murmuring kind of sound, but it's pronounced differently than you would think. It's pronounced soughing. It's T. It's soft without the T. So we have a soughing ghost voice of someone named O. I mean, that is the first challenge that this guy issues you. And this is a challenge to me. I mean, first of all, I got to go look up soughing to make sure I know what I'm talking about. Then I've got to figure out who is this guy named O. Well, all you got to do is look back at the first sentence. He told you already. He didn't say it, but he told you. I mean, the first sentence is, the gods, until the day the towers fell, I believe all the gods were dead. Well, I mean, who are the most famous gods in anyone's history or their education? The Greek gods, of course. And who was probably the best known Greek gods? Orpheus. We got an O, and that's got to be him. And then begin to wonder why it's going to be him. And we're going to find about that too. Then I don't get to the next page, the next paragraph, until he starts talking about the repetitive nature of the television replay of the attack on the Twin Towers. And right in the second line, he throws me again. Since the TV kept playing it over and over like a game of Tetris, no one could win. Now, I don't know what a game of Tetris is. Do you all play Tetris? I mean, I'm sure there are some people who know what it is, but not many of us. So I got to stop and I got to figure out what a game of Tetris is. And again, it's something steeped in history, Russian culture this time. And it's a game of rapid elimination of one kind or another, which I understand has become a very popular computer game, which I don't know anything about because I don't play computer games. So already I'm intimidated by soughing and the Tetris game and who the hell is the guy named O. But I'm still there. And so he didn't mention the Twin Towers, he didn't tell me about any Greek gods, he didn't say anything, but all the things he didn't say became intriguing enough and challenging enough for me to go on to the next page and keep on reading. It is at the bottom of that, if you just go to the second page of that handout on page 4, you see another wonderful technique that a lot of authors use, but many of them don't use it as subtly as this. If you read the page, one of the things that this protagonist sees in television in the replay is the face of an old acquaintance from many years back. And this woman is shown repeatedly, her face out in the crowd outside the scene. And he says, blood was running down the corners of her mouth like in the old days, though not for the same reason. So once again, you're seeing a sentence here that harmony, the balance in this. I mean, he is conveying information to you. I mean, he does say to you, blood was running down the corners of her face. But what he does not say is what keeps you in the game, makes you want to read, like in the old days. So now we got to figure out what. I mean, now I want to know why. I know why blood might be running around her face now, but I don't know why it was running down her face in the old days. Then the next page is the one that really hooked me. And I'm just talking about 2 or 3 techniques here, because I mean, we could do a whole writing course on the first 7 pages of this book. But I want to just point out these gifts that only the artistic writers can really come up with. When you write journalism, and you write history, and you write a lot of other things, I mean, that's writing. But when you look at this, back in my shops where I've taught, where I've had writing, this is called writing. This is real writing. And that's what most of you, I'm sure, want to do. This protagonist then instantly, from this, having watched this scene on TV takes you into her place of business. And it's clear that she is an aging blackjack dealer in Las Vegas. And we had all of 4 or 5 paragraphs now, we still haven't mentioned Twin Towers. But inside the casino, it never happened. So again, he didn't waste any words going back telling us about that you would have done if you were writing a journalism story about what happened. It happened, but it can't happen in there, he says. And then, because in there, nothing is permitted to change. That tells, again, no specific, nothing told, a great deal implied in 4.5 short lines. All inference for you to draw. Then, this is then where he gets me here. She describes this as a 5th-rate hell, and that she is a minor demon posted to it. A succubus, too indifferent to suck. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time studying Greek mythology. I've heard of the word, but I had no clue what a succubus is. And so here again, he's challenged me. Do I want to keep on reading this guy? I mean, I've been to the dictionary 3 times already, and to the computer game, and I'm only on page 5. Well, in this case, it was my job. I got to read this. And even if it hadn't been, I want to know what a succubus is. It's too indifferent to suck. So I go find out. And the answer is done. Do you know what a succubus, the definition that I found of a succubus is a female demon who visits men and has intercourse with them in their sleep. Now, you know, I'm almost 70 years old. I spent every dime I ever made on horses and women. And if I'd known what a succubus was, they wouldn't have gotten it all. I mean, I never even thought about any kind of demon like that. So now I'm really hooked. I am into this game now. Because if nothing else, I want to know what part of this process she's so indifferent about and finds to be such a neutral business. So I am now hooked. I know the game of Tetris. I know that we are dealing with Greek mythology, and I am interested in an aging blackjack dealer who then, after her work is over, she takes me into to her trailer, then through a cut and a chain link fence into a desert where she carries a sniper rifle with a scope, and basically through a life after this that is unlike anything that you could possibly imagine. I mean, this is someone who's able to construct this character. You know, he said in the first, there's a little precede here, said he thinks that his work is inspired by demons, and I believe it. In fact, I had to sit next to him at lunch today, and I was a little worried about it. But when I find a guy who can write sentences like he does, and who is a really wonderful, quiet, nice, congenial fellow, I'm no longer worried about sitting next to him. I am just in awe of anybody that can do this. This is, in effect, one scary piece of work. Not just scary good, but scary in a very serious message. And I try to put a little humor in it today because you won't find any in the rest of this book. I mean, this is really serious, important stuff. And when I've been trying to write fiction for 40 years. I've written published nonfiction books, but my office is full of manuscripts, floppy disks, CDs, and now little SUB ports filled with hundreds of thousands of words. And when I got through reading this book, I said the same thing to myself that I've said many, many times before after I read Robert Penn Warren, Elmore Leonard, Margaret Atwood, the great sentence writers of our time and the great novelists, and that is, what are you thinking? Why in the hell are you trying to write fiction? You're not even in the game. And you ought to give it up. Of course I won't. But I'll tell you one thing. I don't know what he was eating, drinking, smoking, or dreaming when he wrote this, but I want some of it. And I want him to tell me about it before we leave here today. My constant admissions that I shouldn't even be trying to write fiction remind me of an incident in the life of an author whose great novel, All the King's Men, really sent me off on my writing business from the beginning. And this incident tells you the point of this critique, whatever you want to call it. Penn Warren was teaching at Yale. He had a brilliant student named David Milch, who Penn Warren once told he was the greatest dialogue writer he had ever seen. But Milch was I would say not the perfect kind of student. He was perpetually dissatisfied. You couldn't give him enough praise. He had degenerate tendencies toward degeneracy of all aspects. And he was writing a novel, and he decided that one night he's just going to take the chapter over to Penn Warren's house. And he arrives at dinner time and says, "I've got this chapter and I want you to read it." Warren said to him, "Well, you look like a writer. You're acting like a writer," meaning that he had no manners. But Warren read the chapter and was very effusive in his praise about this chapter, how good it was, dialogue, terrific, thought it was just great. To which Milch replies, "Well, now I think I'm through writing. I'm never going to write again." Penn Warren looked at him and said, "David, you understand, I don't give a shit who writes and who doesn't." And Milch then went on to, I think he's the greatest teleplay screenwriter that ever worked on television. I mean, I love his work. He's my new favorite writer because he is a wonderful dialogue writer. He has an incredible sense of timing and the ability to deliver a message. He might someday be in Madison Smartt Bell's class. But I'll tell you this, and I tell you for this reason. No one cares whether you write or not. You're going to have to write for yourself. And that's why I write, and I suspect that's why Madison Smartt Bell writes. And I know that's why all these names I've listed here, Cormac McCarthy and Saul Bellow and Scott Fitzgerald, they wrote for themselves. And when they succeed, as Madison Bell has done, they have then written for all of you and for all of us. And that's what he did in this book. Thank you.
And turnabout is fair play.
All right, well, I have an extremely minor secondary career as a musician, and when I play music in front of people, I spend a certain amount of, say I have a, you got my mic turned on? Can you put a pair of headphones on the gentleman in the back? I have a minor secondary career as a musician, and when I play music in front of people, I spend a certain amount of time and energy lowering the expectations of the audience in the way that Jim Squires just did on his own behalf. And I want to tell you, don't take him seriously about that. It's a rhetorical trick. And he's every bit the craftsman I am, if not more. As I can prove from reading just a few pages out of this book. Let me talk a little bit about the context into which it doesn't quite fall. There, in the 60s, there was a thing called the New Journalism, of which the main apostle was Tom Wolfe. The main book was the lecture Kool-Aid Acid Test. And then there was a thing called the nonfiction novel that was promoted by Norman Mailer and Truman Capote with in cold blood, and then more recently in the 90s, there's become this very popular genre called creative nonfiction, which embraces a lot of different things, but most prominently the pathetic, self-pitying memoir. Well, there was some good, the text for that was Liar's Poker by Mary Carr, which is an excellent book. It's not self-pitying at all, but it's spawned a lot of books like that. But the point of all of these genres, what they really are, is an application of the techniques of fiction writing to nonfiction material. And that's what you see in the opening pages of this book. So you start with this hip-level, boy's-eye view of the principles in a nonfiction story. And within this few pages, it does a number of important things that normally are done in fiction, normally not done in journalism, and not necessarily done in nonfiction books about real events. Contemporary history, which is another category into which Secrets of the Hopewell Box falls. But these opening pages give you the character, a first-person narrator who happens to be the author, the perspective of the character, which is amusingly, just because the idea of seeing the action from belt level is kind of comic, but also somewhat frighteningly because of the stuff these guys have on their belts. It engages the senses, all 5 senses in the first 2 pages. You find out that they smelled sweat, cigarettes, spicy aftershave lotion. You have the detail of the shoes, a whole anthology of the way shoes can look and even feel, whether they're shiny or scuffed. If they don't have soles in them, you're actually walking the streets of Nashville on cardboard. Sensation, like the idea that the creases in their pants are sharp enough to cut. And these are all incorporated in service of a fully realized dramatic scene, which is interestingly too, it's not quite what you call a full scene. It is what technically in fiction you call half scene, because it doesn't describe a single event actually. It's a sort of montage of many events that occurred over a period of time when the narrator, the author as a boy, was taken around by his grandfather, Dave White, into the company of all these people who ran Nashville politics and law enforcement. So the risk in writing that kind of scene is that it becomes, by virtue of its, or by defect of its generality, it becomes kind of generic and dull. And he keeps preventing that by giving you sensory information that makes you feel as if you yourself are there in the body of this boy, observing what's going on. Now, what I really wanted to talk about in this opening is how it lays out certain structures that define the whole way the rest of the book works. And it does it in a very efficient way and a very effective way. The first is to establish a pattern of alternation between this type of material, which is directly told in first person from the point of view of the author at different ages, and that's entirely personal. And throughout the book, chapters like that, they occupy far fewer pages than the rest, alternate with reporting, I'm going to say, on the events in Nashville politics and law enforcement over, 25, 30-year period. That's basically reportage of fact and history, although wonderfully enlivened by anecdote, of which the author has a tremendous fund because of his because of his privileged position. But as you move into the book, you know that you're going to return to this other type of material, which is a little bit easier to engage with, I guess, from the point of view of the fiction reader, at least, because you have the character observing the scene and the fully dramatized scene to be part of. That pattern, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, is an artificial structure that's a kind of blueprint through which organizes the narrative, both for the writer and the reader, I think. This opening, did you have the entire prologue or just a few pages of it?
First 4 pages.
First 4 pages of it. Well, I'm going to do a number of unfair things here. Because the most significant thing is on page 8. You don't have that, so you're going to have to buy the book. Sorry. It establishes the friendship between Dave White, who's a policeman of different stripes for most of the period covered, and Garner Robinson, who's a player in the county political machine. And this friendship is a constant factor in a story which otherwise involves so many different people and so many different events that its centrifugal forces are considerable. It has a natural tendency to pull itself apart, but a lodestone in it is this relationship between these two men, and one of whom happens to be the author's grandfather, Dave White. So that's established in these first few pages, and you know that that's kind of your constant, the constant factor in all of these different stories to which the text you're reading will return. That is a structural element that is not artificial. It's inherent in the material, and it's just been sort of teased and sculpted out by the author. And the third thing, this is actually kind of subtle, is for the purposes of this book, is the establishment of a first-person narrator. In the pages that you've read, this little boy is, looking but not really understanding. And I forget who told me a long time ago, but it probably was George Garrett who told me most of the things I know about writing. But he said, by rule and by law, inevitably any story with a first-person narrator is about the narrator, whether they appear in the story or not, because they influence it so much. You're getting it through them. I don't know if you want to quite say that that's true with this book. It is very true, however, of a book called All the King's Men, which has been referred to. How many people in here have read All the King's Men? Well, that's okay. Go read that. That's an important thing for you to read still. I was over at Vanderbilt the other day talking to a bunch of graduate students under the glowering bust of Red Warren, and they hadn't read it either. They hadn't heard of it, though, which was good for 20-somethings. That novel is structured in a way kind of similar to this book, but the curious thing is, although this book was written later, it is the raw material for All the King's Men. But All the King's Men has a first-person narrator named Jack Burden, who's a reporter, and he's not really a major player in most of the events. He's the person who investigates them and filters them for you. But because it is a novel and not a non-fictional story, he's brought more forward as a character. Well, that's not necessarily built into it's a decision on the part of the author. This author could have placed himself more in the foreground if he wanted to. And you'd have a very interesting story which also resembles the story in All the King's Men of Jack Burden and his involvement with the other events having to do with conflicted loyalties, and what I think is the main point of Warren's book, and also maybe of this one, is that you can't live in the world and not be implicated in all of its elements, whether they're nice or nasty. But in this case, although we know the first-person narrator is there, we see him very little in the main parts of the book, the longer parts of the book that recount the episodes of Nashville history that are most of its content. First-person narrator is almost entirely effaced, but like the clock pendulum, you keep coming back to these short passages that put him in the foreground, in which I assume this was a decision of the publisher, are printed in larger type, so as if to signal to you that here's another easy part. But I don't know quite why they did that. In any case, even though this character doesn't appear, his relationship to the material controls everything, and that's established on with this one line on page 8, close to the end of this prologue. And I'm going to read that to you. I'm not going to tell you to look at it because, well, you know you don't have it. Well, let me back up a little bit because you don't have this part. Whatever these men had been, I knew firsthand. As a boy and as a man, I had known them and all their friends, the cops, the gamblers, the bootleggers, the saloon keepers, the preachers, and the ward healers. I saw them with their wives, with other people's wives, with the waitresses and barmaids, and I had grown up with their children. Their secrets were mine. And then here's the part that I think is the key to the whole strategy. I had been inside the machine without ever seeing it as such. I had been inside the machine without ever seeing it as such. And that gives you the DNA of the whole book, and after you read that sentence, you kind of always know where you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to ask each of you the same question, and then I'll trade up. First question is, how do you decide, because everybody's faced with everybody's trying to write something, and you want to get it published or you want to get it read, how do you decide that this thing that you're thinking about is worth the time, that this is the one you really need to spend the time on? How am I going to decide to dedicate the time to write this? Jim?
Well, you know, I think it depends on the time of the writer's life and where you are in the career. I mean, the first one is the hardest always, because you usually don't have a clue whether you're going to get it published. In my case, 2 or 3 of my books were solicited by publishers, and so the draw was the certainty of publication and the money. This is not one of those. The history of this book is a better story than the book itself. And maybe we get into it a little bit, but I don't want to take up the time. But I would think that the decision to spend your time it goes back to the point I made in the beginning. You're writing this for? Is it worth doing it? And when you start to write, who are you writing it for? I write it for myself. And if it doesn't get published, I got a lot of stuff not published. So I write what I like and what I want to write. And because of my journalism background, I think I look and want to write stories that I could never tell in journalism, that I ran across, I saw, I wanted to tell, I couldn't tell. And it's just more rewarding to me to sit down and tell them in a fictional format. All the King's Men, this novel we're talking about, it basically decided the direction of my life. All the King's Men, and the reason there's some similarity is because it had so much influence on me. I was looking for a way to tell this story, and Jack Burton told that story. I actually had to take this book from fiction back to nonfiction, and that's how we got the first person narrator, and then the third person observer, a narrator telling you a reporting story. When I wrote this originally in 1971, I was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard. I wrote it as a collection of short stories based on stories I wanted to tell that I hadn't been able to tell. Why couldn't I tell them? They're about my family, they're about my friends, there were things I saw, but I fictionalized them to the point where they were hardly identifiable by anyone. But then when I had a chance to write this book, which was just an accident, the publisher said I had given him the original manuscripts of the short stories. and he said, we want to do this in nonfiction. So I had to go back and prove everything that I had made up or else discard it. Pick out what was true and what was not true. And so I just went back and you end up with a lot of that first person stuff that sounds like fiction that lets the narrator tie this thing together. But then the other, what the rest of it is absolute truth done in the best journalism I could do.
So Madison, how do you decide this is going to be?
Right, well, this is a basic difference between a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, and it's the nonfiction, I have done some of that too. A lot of it's, I've got a couple of books that are like that whether it was solicited, proposed to me by somebody else, or I thought, hey, this might go. I might could sell this, make some money. But for fiction, which is most of what I've written, I constantly play around with different ideas all the time, and some of them just sort of fizzle out, and some of them kind of take on a little life of their own and start to grow by themselves, and those are the ones that I do. And I don't even really know why I'm doing them. But I do know that I can't really force it. I can encourage it a little bit, but it has to happen on its own. I do agree very wholeheartedly with what you said about writing to please yourself. I tell people that all the time.
Jim, you've written with editors and then you've written all by yourself. Most people here don't have anybody helping them write their book. How do you self-edit?
Well, I think I spent many, many years in John Seigenthaler's service rewriting other people. And then I was an editor myself for many years. I edited a lot of other people's copies. I think of my own ability. I think I'm a better editor than I am a writer. I can fix stuff and make stuff better, but when I start trying to edit myself, I'm terrible. I throw it away. I start over. I've got half-done stories, half manuscripts. I go back and read something that I wrote, and I think that's the worst thing I ever heard. I tear it up. I need an editor as bad as anyone needs an editor, and the older I get, the more editing I need. And I will tell you that the best editor I ever had edited Secrets. So when I decide to go, I'm afraid to go places where I don't have a good editor. The editors that have been in my life have been saviors. I love them. So I don't think I'm very good self-editor. I can edit you and Madison, but not me.
Madison, what kind of questions do you ask yourself when you're looking at a page that you've written? Now I got to rewrite it.
Well, I never do that. It's a terrible weakness, actually. I hate to rewrite, and but half of my life has been spent being an editor for other writers, beginning writers, student writers. I teach creative writing, which is a big industry nowadays in academia. And so I have the same problem that Jim just described, and what I can add to it is maybe some notion of why that is. And for me, the reason is that I need to. I hope nobody in here's ever told any lies. But if you want to succeed with a lie, you have to believe it yourself. Very important. And same with a made-up story. You have to believe it yourself and kind of be inside it. And then all you have to do is, you don't feel like you're inventing it. You just feel like you're describing something that actually happened. But in order for you to get in that psychological place, you have to switch off your editorial functions, actually. Or the inspiration and the intuition won't work. So basically, I work on things for a long time in my head, and then when I write them, I have a certain facility. I can think that they're gonna be basically okay, and not need a lot of work. And that's worked out for me pretty well most of the time. But in cases where I've also had some really good editors, maybe not so regularly as you, but I have had some truly great ones. I learned from them, and I also strangely learned from myself in the sense that because I spend a lot of my time teaching and and I too claim to be good at that. I'm good at working on other people's manuscripts much better than on my own. On the other hand, I do find that with an effort, I can transfer some of the skills that I've learned from working on other people's stuff to my own thing, and sort of change the way I'm looking at it and try to. But I don't really like doing it. I'd rather not.
Let me tell you a strange story about it. One of my friends is Jane Smiley, who is a very successful novelist, and I think a very good one.
Yeah.
Smiley was
Her methods are very extreme.
Smiley was one of my horse clients, but I also gave her the first big literary award she ever had when I was at the Tribune. She won the Heartland Award for
1,000 Acres.
1,000 Acres. And so I've known her a long time. So she wrote a book called Horse Heaven, and she asked me to edit before she wrote this book. She came to my farm, and every time I saw her, we saw each other a lot. She asked me 9 million questions about horses and the horse business. And at one point even, she's got a character in this book that is a horse whisperer who believes that they understand they can talk to horses, and they talk to horses, and the horse talks back. And so I became the horse. She'd say, what would the horse say? So I would tell her what the horse said. And then she'd write this novel. And it's a hell of a novel. It's okay. But when she sent it to me, it's 1,400 pages. And it's set in California. But she then goes off into Kentucky and New York, about which she knew nothing. So all the stuff that she had about Kentucky and New York, when it came to me, and I had to cut this thing, it was terrible. I mean, 1,400 pages. And so the stuff that was no good was all the stuff I had given her. So I cut it all out. I mean, she'd have this big long chapter about something supposed to happen in the horse business in Kentucky, and it was awful. And the stuff that she knew in California, she knew she could write, and it was great. So I cut all this stuff out, 600 pages. And she published A Horse Heaven, and that 600 pages was all my stuff to start with. I rewrote it all in the way I would want to write it. It became Headless Horseman, which is my own book. And there was not one line from her, nothing. I threw all her stuff away and just wrote the Kentucky story from scratch. But that's what's missing out of the only part of me that's in Horse Heaven is the horse talking back to the horse whisperer.
Madison, the character May, how did you build her up? Where did you begin, and how did you create her? And was her creation, because it's a woman, different than other characters that you created?
I can honestly say it just kind of happened. I don't know why. I started to hear the voice, and then I started writing down what the voice said. I don't mean that I actually heard it with my ears. I do have auditory hallucinations, but they're not that evolved. It's mainly just roosters. I do hear roosters that aren't there sometimes, but not whole novels. But it was like it's like planting an acorn and forgetting about it for a few years. Years ago, I received a kind of introductory package for a series of books that was hiring literary novelists to retell mythology, mythological stories, and I saw that they were paying $50,000. I thought, I wouldn't mind a piece of that. And I'd call my agent called them, and they said, yeah, you should write up a little treatment. So I wrote up a thing that was about the idea of, I think this was before 9/11 actually. I wrote 500 words that had the germ of the character in it. And then they turned it down. And so I totally forgot about it for 5 years. And then somehow it had sprouted. I wandered by the same place again in my mind. I thought, look, there's something there. That was about it.
Jim, we talked earlier about Part of the handout is a page that one of my students wrote about printing to proofread, because I've realized that my students don't print, they read it in the computer and they don't print it, and so they do all their rewriting in the computer screen, which I didn't know they were doing it because I didn't think it was possible. And you've taken 2 newspapers from hot type to computers, and now today, what do you think about mistakes that beginning writers make? What kinds of things do they do wrong?
Well, you mean because they're writing on computers now?
Or just in general, either one?
You know, the only observation that I am absolutely confident to drop out is that I don't know about the students, but I don't see as well editing on the computer as I do on paper. The printout is very important to me. When I write if I write a letter, or I do a lot of writing for free, and in some crusades. We're trying to reform. I write for the New York Times a lot. I write for some other magazines, and I cannot edit anything on the screen. I mean, I don't see it. I do not see that I have missed an article, I've misspelled a word. So I'm addicted to print, and I don't know whether that's just simply due to my generation and the way my brain developed. You know, it's a lot different when you are reading and you're doing everything with linear reasoning and writing and you got your hands on it. I read a fascinating story about this guy I mentioned earlier, David Milch, who basically started writing for television with Hill Street Blues, and then he wrote an NYPD Blue, and then I can't remember the name of that next, it was some Chicago detective, and now he's doing Faulkner, and he was the student I was talking about, Penn Warner student. The way he writes, he has a big screen and someone else with his hands on their hands on the computer, stenographer. And he has a back problem, so he lays down on his back. And he writes just orally, saying what he wants to say. Now, admittedly, he's writing dialogue a lot because he's writing for TV. But then he sees the words come up on the screen. Well, when you ask him why he does that, he says just the use of his hands to do it is intrusive in his thinking. And now here's a guy that grew up, was taught by a poet. What it does to him, if you're doing it with your hands, I think it interrupts the meter and the rhythm of your words and your sentences. And that's why he does that, because he thinks that's another function that if he doesn't use, he writes, and so he'll see it up there, and he hasn't touched it, and he'll say, take out this word or rephrase it, and then he sees it and he likes it. And if you go down through the dialogue of any of his scripts of any of his television shows, they're almost like poems. So I'm not sure that just the mechanical work of fooling with the computer, plus the change, the vision problem with the computer, just for me anyway, I can't see the problem on the screen, but I can see it on the paper.
I'm a big fan of any way you get the words on the page is the right way, if it works for you. You can dictate it, you can write it longhand, I've never heard anyone dictating and watching someone else type it.
That was a new one on me, but I'll tell you.
Stephen Hawking does that, I think.
Who does?
I don't think we want to, we're all over 50 here, some of us by more than a couple of years, and so we all grew up without having computers available, but I don't think they're necessarily evil. They're a little bit deceptive for us because our habits were formed earlier, but I began to notice, teaching students for whom working on computers front to back is natural as breathing, that they did some things that you can't do without, like they throw their ideas down at the bottom of the file. I started doing that myself. I do think it is a good idea to read the thing on a piece of paper from time to time, because at that point it becomes a concrete object, and that's important. Because at some point, if you're planning to make this into a book that somebody's going to hold in their hand and read, even if they're holding it on a Kindle, it's going to be fixed. And and when it's fixed, you see things in it that you wouldn't see if it's streaming in the way screens make it stream.
And you've written a book about Mink Slide, and then your book, The Hopewell Box, was events that you were at least tangentially part of. When you're doing research, how do you know that you're doing too much is going to hamper the writing process because you've done too much research, or how do you know these people are telling you the truth?
Well, you know, the sequel to Mink Slide is a pure historical fiction, and when you're dealing with a real character like Mr. Luby, Z. Alexander Luby, and Thurgood Marshall are in Mink Slide, and Walter White, who was chairman of the NAACP, and Jackie Robinson. That stuff is journalism research. You just make sure that anything you say about those people is not disputed by historical fact, and they do need to play roles. But in Mr. Luby's case, there's some line in him, and I don't know if it's ever there are things about Mr. Luby that I have to imagine, and they are not critical truths as part of this history. For example, a lot of this story has to do with an attempt to assassinate Thurgood Marshall when he was a lawyer in Columbia, Tennessee. If it deals with that, it has to be right on. But if I'm letting Mr. Luby muse about some things he's seen in Columbia, they need to reflect the greater truth about the era. For example, at one point, he ran across a sign outside Lewisburg that basically said anybody that's not white shouldn't be seen in this county after daylight. Well, I mean, I'm going to imagine his reaction to that. He's with Thurgood Marshall when it happens. So when I start to deal with that, what I try to do with that is make sure whatever they say is in character that I know them to be, because they both had, I knew both of them actually. And I've interviewed a lot of people about them. So it's got to be not a departure from what they are, and at the same time an accurate reflection of the times and the place. And that's a hard part for me. I mean, it's difficult. I think I have trouble with it.
I think in regard to that, you can never know too much yourself, but the trick is restraining yourself from telling the audience everything that you have learned about some historical subject just because you're obsessed with it and find it interesting.
Because you can get in trouble that way.
Well, you get off the subject.
You get away. You lose the art. You know, this writing, fiction in particular, is a combination of craft and art. And so there are a lot of good craft, but there are damn few great writers. And when you have to go in fiction, when you have to tell it exactly, the best thing to do is show it. And you got to figure out how to show it without telling it. That's what this guy's a master at those sentences that have a perfect balance, a harmony between the information you're conveying and the information you're not specifically conveying but is there. And that's the challenge and the majesty of the whole thing for me. I mean, I love that.
Okay, I'm going to get to questions from y'all in just a second, so start thinking up some. Madison, one of the things I think is really important when you're writing is the journey from my brain as a writer to the reader's brain, and unfortunately it's got to go through the printed page. It doesn't go straight. So being clear is important and hard. And so what's the difference, do you think, when does writing get to be too highfalutin for its own good?
Well, when you can't understand it anymore. I don't know. Every now and then, I mean, I think, I think that's it. I mean, I can't, James Joyce is a great writer. who I admire. I really admire, Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist. I've tried to read Ulysses many times. I always the ejector seat just goes off by itself about halfway into Nighttown, and you're almost there, Then I realized I haven't understood anything in this book for 200 pages. And yes, so that for me is the cutoff point. And I think that, yes, you can shoot yourself in the foot doing that. Every now and then I have a student who wants to overwrite to the point of incomprehensibility, and at that point we really have bitter arguments, because they usually feel pretty convinced that they're doing the right thing. And I said, I know you want to do this, and you have a reason that you want to do this, but my taste is Catholic. It really is, and you are not holding my attention. I can't stand it here.
What happens when you can't convince them?
They quit working with me and go somewhere else. I mean, a happy story I'll say was a guy called John McManus, who was a student at Goucher, and he was from around here, actually, from not right around here, but from closer to Knoxville, Cades Cove area. And I never say somebody's not going to make it. I learned that before I met him. But his first stories, he wanted to be a writer real bad, and he was writing this very conventional Southern story, not very well. And I thought, oh, this is sad. This guy really wants it. I don't think he's going to get there. But I didn't say to him, I didn't say give up. I never say that. And he went to England for a year, and I don't know what he did, but he came back and gave me a story that actually made me say, "Can I touch you?" And then, but with beginning writers, and as you learn the craft, one of the great problems is inconsistency. And I think for everybody here, it's a problem. There's two problems that go with it. You can't evaluate your own work in the beginning in a very consistent way, nor can you do it in a consistent way. You'll have good days, bad days, good text, but this goes away. If you keep practicing, you get through that phase. But so he wrote a brilliant batch of stories, and then he started on this novel that was he wrote the whole thing, and I had to read the whole thing because it was worth it, and then we fought over every page. For 6 months, I would say, where I said, this is incomprehensible, John. And I like your work, because I love these stories that are already being published even. But this is incomprehensible. You don't do this to yourself, blah, blah. Eventually gave up on that book and wrote another book, which was successful.
Okay, same last question for each of you is, what's the best advice anybody ever gave you about writing that you would like to pass on? Jim?
I think the best advice that I had is to finish writing something at night, or whenever you decide to quit, to have some idea where you're going the next day. Don't quit confounded by your own work or where your path is. And then but before you write again, when you come back the next day, you edit what you wrote before. I read what I wrote the day before, and I say, what were you thinking? And throw it away. But I still know where I'm going, because I had decided the day before.
The best advice I've ever had or given is what Jim ended his opening presentation with, which is write for yourself and nobody else, and don't be concerned with external rewards, because they aren't going to have anything to do with the quality of what you wrote.
Who's got a question? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have advice on how to moderate pacing in a novel?
How to moderate pacing? Tell me more about what the problem is.
Like if you want to have a novel go quickly but not kind of deceive the reader, then how do you do that?
Well, there's is this a book? Is this a text that's more for the eye or for the ear? Would you say?
I'm just asking, in a novel, how do you pick up the pace without starting too fast?
Well, there's as many ways as there are novels. But let me try to give a couple of answers to the question. I feel like certain books are written for the eye. They are more like reader experiences them more like movies, and in that kind of text, as well as in the movie, the way to accelerate is by jump cutting or cross cutting. But you speed up the cuts, right, screenwriter? You cut faster and move through bigger pieces of time to create an impression of speed, and you can modulate that any way you want to, if you understand that that's what you're doing. The other kind of text is a text that the reader experiences less like they're watching a movie and more like they're listening to somebody tell them a story. And in that case, I see you responding as if you were in that category. In that case, it's the quality of the told story. If you got somebody, saying, well, long ago and far away, at the beginning of time, there was an enormous turtle. Very slow. You have somebody mad and say, I got to tell you what happened to me yesterday. You aren't going to believe this. Now let me tell you. And just tripping over themselves with the rate of their discourse, and like a manic person talking to you. So that again, if you understand that that's what you got, you can modulate it. But it's the quality of the voice that's telling the story. And of course, like any human being, they don't just stay not always at one note or one speed. So you can, if you have a fast talking narrative voice, you can make a decision to slow it down from time to time, and that creates a little wave-like pattern in the text that's relaxing to the reader, and makes them stay in.
Can you answer that question too?
I think that one of the definitions I've heard for and used in my courses for good writing is easy reading. And when you read it back to yourself, if it reads easily, your pace is probably pretty good. If it doesn't read easily and you're stopping yourself with your own words, you got a pace problem. You need to edit. And I don't know any other way to do that. It's when I read it back to me in chunks of a page or 4 or 5 paragraphs. The question is, was there any rhythm there? Was that an easily read, or did I stop you? When I stop you with my language, I want to stop you. It's intentional. So if you're stopping people unintentionally, you got a pace problem.
Do you read your work out loud?
I don't know whether I read it out loud or not. It's kind of a softening murmur that I use.
Are there roosters sometimes?
Just got a question. Yes, ma'am.
Your comment about hypnotism is very interesting. So do you advise to hypnotize yourself, or would you advise for a professional hypnotist?
Oh, I think if you're a writer, you're better off doing it yourself. You might want to, but if I got interested in hypnotism I did it first for therapeutic reasons, and then I thought, hey, there's a lot of other things that this could be used for. But what a therapeutic hypnotist will tell you is that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis, and what they're basically doing is teaching you how to hypnotize yourself. So you could do that. I mean, you could make one trip, to have an experience that was guided by somebody else who's a legitimate person who's not going to try to influence you for your harm. But otherwise, I think there's lots of ways to. A lot of tapes are marketed for the purposes like relaxation tapes and so on and so forth. Some of those can be useful. I think the opening phase of hypnosis is called induction, and I feel when you read about writers' habits, which beginning writers avidly do because they think they're going to find the Rosicrucian secret of how you write. To write like Ernest Hemingway, I have to go to a certain cafe in Paris. where he used to go every morning and get the coffee, the shot of brandy, at a certain pen, et cetera, et cetera. I, for years, had this pen that was very hard to persuade to work. I wrote all my fiction with rapidograph drafting pens and clog constantly, so that every day I'd spend, 15 to 30 minutes cleaning the pen to get it to write. Graham Greene, who was really extraordinary in this regard, would claim that he would, every day before he began writing, he would go down to the street and wait for a certain pattern of numbers and letters to appear on the license plate of a passing car. Months could go by, low productivity, but the whole point of this it is a means to put yourself apart from yourself so that you can enter the imaginary world. And I kind of think that if you become conscious of this, you can find ways to do it more deliberately and more reliably, and it doesn't have to be all about the particular pencils or, the coincidence of letters on the license plate.
There's a very good book called From Where You Dream by Robert Olin Butler that gets into teaching you how to write from your unconscious. It's very, and he blurred my book too, by the way, but it's a really good book. From Where You Dream. Another question? Yes.
Jim, you mentioned that there was a better story in the story behind the book you're talking about than the story itself. And I wondered if, as a journalist, you can turn up your need not to bury the lead. If you find out what a better story, how do you?
Well, what I was talking about was the story of how this Secrets was first written as a bunch of short stories, and I mean the story I was talking about is that I wrote it when I was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard, and I had a great friend who was the book editor of Newsday, and he edited it for me. And finally, I sent it to an editor that I had met at a dinner party, a woman at Houghton Mifflin, and she liked it. She was going to buy it. They offered me $5,000 advance, which was big money to me in 1971. And so she gave me a check, and we had a big celebration. Jack and I did in my apartment, which we drank great quantities of alcohol. And sometime in the middle of the night, Schwartz got drunk enough to start criticizing my work. And he had edited it, but now he's telling me the truth about how bad it is. And that I should go back and I should say that stuff and publish it when I learned to write. Broke my heart. But I took it seriously. And we sobered up and we're in pretty good shape by 8 o'clock the next morning. And we took it. I made him go with me. It's his problem. We rode the train over from Cambridge to Boston, and we were waiting on the steps at Houghton Mifflin when Phoebe came to work, and I gave her the check back. And I took the manuscript. She gave me back the manuscript, and I put it in an old briefcase, and it stayed there for 20 years. And only came out when I was asked to write a book about Nashville, to follow Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. The publisher had published Midnight in the Garden, and he wanted something that was like it. And so he said, could you write a book about Nashville? And I said, I got one in my briefcase. I dug it out and gave it to him, and he said, we like all this stuff, but it's got to be a nonfiction book. So that's how I ended up with some of the stuff that reads a little bit like fiction, and some which doesn't, because I had to go do real journalism again and make sure that the stories I had fictionalized about did in fact happen in a certain way. And so I had to come down and interview a lot of people. And so that manuscript it was 20 years old before it ever saw an editor.
Well, one thing you said, it might have been really, really lucky that the book didn't come out when it came out, if it wasn't really ready.
Well, I guess right.
Because if when you're sending something out, if you've got somebody, what I call somebody real, like an editor or a publisher, or somebody who wants to read it, it had better be ready for them to read, because they're only going to read it one time. And if it's not fantastic, that's it with them. And the very first thing I ever wrote which is a screenplay based on a children's book. I finished it, and my sister had dated a guy who was now dating a famous actress, and so we went out to lunch. He said, "I'd love to read your script. If it's good, I'll help you." And I thought, oh, I better get it to her tonight, because she's so excited. It's not really true, but she did agree to help me. And so I finished it in a month, and I dropped it off at the hotel, and then we came back to a friend of mine's house who was also a writer, and he read it while I took a nap in the other room. I mean, he read it right then. And when I woke up from the nap, he did what your friend did. He just blew it to pieces. And he said, "This is in no way near ready." And I thought, well, I've already given it to the famous actress. And it turns out the hotel lost it. And so it took me 6 more months of rewriting before it was actually finished. I thought it was finished, but it wasn't. So my thought is, make sure it's really, really finished.
But what they had done, my problem is they'd already accepted it, and I had the $5,000 in my pocket. So I had to be about 3 sheets in the wind to agree to give that money back, which I did. But what was wrong with it was dialogue.
Most people would not do that.
Well, I was so afraid that I would embarrass myself. I mean, Schwartz was very persuasive. He was a great editor. And what was wrong with it, I mean, there are a lot of things wrong with it, but what was really bad about it is I couldn't write dialogue worth a damn. And it's taken me years and years to even approach being able to write dialogue.
It's good now.
Well, I've had a great teacher. One of my friends is Sam Shepard, the playwright. He was one of my horse customers. And if there's a better dialogue writer anywhere, I don't know who it is. And he told me his techniques. And he writes dialogue that he's heard somewhere. And he just scribbles it down. And he's got lists, pages and pages of things people said. So when it finally comes out, it may not have anything to do with the character, but it's real talk. And that's why he's so good. I learned that technique. I can write a little bit of dialogue now. Maybe.
Question?
I'm a nonfiction writer. I write a monthly column for a local women's magazine about health. And I have a book manuscript that I have completed that starts out as memoir, my own stories of dealing with women's issues and health and body issues and all that sort of thing. I'm a personal trainer as well. And then launches into the stories of my clients and what they've been through and how they've gone through their journeys. And I'm told that I need to get a greater platform nationwide, and that I should start doing more freelance writing for larger magazines. And 2 questions about that. First, if I write something that I'm planning to submit, can I post it on my blog for my current readers, or is that considered publishing it and then it's a reprint? And then question number 2 is, do you have any general advice about reaching out into a larger market for freelance writing?
Well, Madison can probably answer that better than I can, but I'll tell you one thing, all of us are seeking a larger platform. I don't know, I haven't really looked into the question of whether if you put something out there, it's been published. Have you?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. You're saying, you want to know, you're writing a column for a magazine, they pay you for that. And so clearly you're not going to put your column on a personal blog. You're saying like fragments of this book.
Well,
Could you put them
that, or I'm told that before I even submit the book to publishers or agents or anything, that I just need to have 11 presents. So.
Well, I don't know. I don't think it would help, but it's not necessarily true. I think the idea too is that we were not going to talk about these kinds of marketing questions, right? So we're supposed to be, no, but let's answer this one, but I don't want to encourage a rash out necessarily. We're going to try to talk about craft and more than career, but let's stay with it because for a minute, because I think the question of audience has become very fluid. In one sense, we feel that it's disappeared because less and less people buy books. On the other hand, you're in a field where there are a lot of readers for that kind of material. They read your column. You work with them directly on their bodies too. They are. Can you reach more of them through the internet? Yeah, probably. Probably best idea would be, some people do their own blogs and they get, they somehow attract attention, but there's so much of that out there. You really can't tell if anybody's looking, so.
To clarify, I'm saying if I have a magazine in mind and I write an article for them and I'm sending it to them and I'm pitching it to them, and I put it on my website or my blog.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. That's
Yeah, the first
'cause
thing you do is you screw yourself with the other
if you're
person.
trying to sell it, this is what your mother told you too. Don't give it away. Don't give it away first. A lot of publishers have forgotten this principle, but still else.
Yes, sir.
Do you guys ever dream about your projects you're working on? And if so, do your dreams influence, your projects?
I've had dreams that solved writing problems in such a spectacular way. I would be euphoric when I woke up and then realized that it didn't make any sense at all. That's me. Does that happen to you?
I keep a pad and pencil near my bed. And my problem when I have a great dream that I think is terrific, I forget it before I can write it down. But I have written down a few things. And so I have something, a drawer that I stole the name from, is DreamWorks. And I've just got fragments of things that occurred to me. Because I have dreams about things that I could possibly not have knowledge of. I mean, how could I know that? Which makes me think you live in something, you're back again from some other place. If any of those things I can remember, I write them down, and they become little nuggets and little fragments. And sometimes you can find a place for them when you're writing fiction. They will fit. I've never had a big idea spawned by any of those and say, hey, this is a book I'm going to write. But I sure have had some pretty good scene stealers that just occurred to me sometime in the middle for some reason. I don't know why.
I think writing down your dreams or keeping some kind of dream diary is a good thing to do because it puts you more in touch with your unconscious mind. And that's where you might not get specific stories out of it, but if you have that door open, it's a good thing.
I will tell you where they are helpful. When you have those terrible dreams, like if your cell phone keeps falling apart in your hand while you're trying to call someone.
a good dream, man.
That's a really good dream. But the frustration that you feel trying to make that damn phone work is not lost on me. I mean, that is if you can write that down and hold on to it, or if a person is lost, or I like the humor in almost everything. Jane Smiley told me one time, once you get past age 50, write every sentence with your tongue in your cheek. And I think it's really good advice. But especially with humor. I mean, I have had some dreams where I played I talk about a comedic character. I am one. And I have written those down, and someday, hopefully, if I live long enough, they'll find a place somewhere.
There are questions from this side of the room. Yes.
I wonder if either of you or both of you have a really memorable failure, a project that you didn't lose interest in, that you wanted desperately to make it work, but you just couldn't do it.
How many do you want to hear? How long do you have?
Yeah, I've been a few. I had a failed first novel that was never published. I wasn't really ready to write it. I have my thing is, I don't have too many of those with any evidence of them on paper because I do so much of the initial planning and I guess you might say work in my head. If I want to pick up a pencil or sit down in front of the computer, I usually have the momentum to carry it out. But not everybody is that way, and in fact, I think that may be a little bit weird.
When you say you do the work in your head, what do you do? And then how do you start?
I imagine enough of the story to have a confidence that I can complete it, whether it's a novel-length story or a short story. If it's a short story, when I get ready to write, I can usually write it in a sitting or 2 or 3 sittings, but like a total of maybe 8 hours or something. And a novel, obviously, you got to stay with it for longer, but certain things are in place. I know the shape of the whole story. I know how it's going to end. That's very important to me. So It's not a general rule by any means. A lot of people have to write a whole book in order to figure out what the ending should be. There's nothing wrong with that, except it's extremely painful and means you have to write more drafts. But some people, that's just their nature. That's how you got to do it. But for me, I can kind of see it, you know. I keep looking at the thing in my mind until I see enough of it that I can simply start describing it with a sense of its total shape.
I've got this goes back to what I said earlier about, I don't care how you get it on the page, just get it on the page, whatever method works for you, that means that method works. We had a guest in my screenwriting class who wrote a movie called Playing by Heart, which has got my all-time favorite dialogue, and he hates to write. And he's got plenty of money, so he can walk up and down on the beach every day, which is what he does. He walks up and down on the beach every day for 3 months, all day long, thinking about what he wants to write. And that movie, if you go rent it, Playing by Heart, he finally finishes walking up and down the beach and came in and locked himself in his room for 8 straight days and wrote the movie. Now, this is the depressing part, is that 95% of what you see on screen is first draft, which is kind of terrifying. But the method is his method.
The whole point is that it's not. He just did all that revisionist stuff in his head.
Yeah, and he knew what he was going to do.
People say the same thing about me, like, how can you do this with apparent effortlessness, you know, first draft, blah, blah, and it's like, you know, I'm doing all this, I'm doing it mentally.
Well, I had one of those monumental failures that stayed with me a long time and actually kept me from even attempting to write fiction for several years. The first piece of fiction I tried to write was a novel called Sidewinder. It was about Chicago. And I had a great agent. I had the most powerful agent in New York at the time. And so she was able to sell this book, or at least to give me an email telling me that it had been sold, or that this was Amanda Urban was my agent. And she sold this novel to one of the top publishing houses of fiction places in New York, to a young woman, female editor. And the female editor said she wanted to buy it. She's going to take it to the committee in these. I mean, they don't just get to publish their own thing, especially when they're young editors. But this shop, that I won't even mention, but it had 4 or 5 really great editors in it in those days. Sonny Maida was one of them. And so I was ecstatic over this. I thought, gee, I sold my first novel. I love this work. I've worked on it and everything. This was in the summer, early in the summer. The young woman went out to Long Island for a summer, where a lot of those people do. She got Lyme's disease and died. And so the novel got pitched over to the committee, and I lost the vote by 1 vote in the committee on whether they were going to publish this novel. And I didn't think I'd ever recover from it. And that book's never been published. I've got it still in my stash of stuff.
You have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask each of you, Jim, in Secret of the Hopewell Box, you write about your grandfather, someone you knew, loved deeply. There are aspects of the story in which you are required to present him in a light that is, for some people, distinctly unfavorable.
Good.
Madison, you write about an overture, and then about Nathan Bedford Forrest. Men you don't know except for reputation. But there are controversies that surround both of them as they surround Dave White in real life. I'd just like for you to talk briefly about the emotional challenge to present for the reader material that casts the protagonist in a negative light. People about whom you've decided to write, and at some point or another, for whom you feel some affection or admiration.
I was hoping that would come up because I saw in reading Secrets of the Hopewell Box that Jim and I are both writing, some of the time anyway, about people that some characters or real people, in the case of Bedford Forrest, I make a fictional character out of a real person, whose reality I nevertheless have to respect. And these are people who some people find admirable and others find completely reprehensible. And so there is a bit of a problem because your own attitude, I had extremely mixed feelings about Bedford Forrest, but in a way that's why I was interested. I think interesting characters aren't all one way. You know, it's hard to write an interesting book about a saint. I think a few people have done it. If you got somebody who's all monster, that's kind of dull too. But it's the mixture and the tension between these qualities in the character that's interesting to the writer and to readers as well, because most people experience this in themselves.
In my case, my grandfather was a big influence in my life, but it was not only a positive influence, it was a negative influence. He had a violent temper. He was a brutal man, but at the same time, he had some redemptive qualities, and I had to finally look at him as a creature of his time. He was typical of a Southern white policeman in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. What was untypical about him is that he was an extraordinary character. I mean, John knew him, and if a writer or anyone encountered him and watched his life and knew him like I did, you begin to look at him as if he's a character in him. And he was so interesting to me and helped me hold this book together so far. My mother didn't like some of the things that I ended up saying about him, but I was already a fan of Elmore Leonard. Did anybody read Elmore Leonard? Elmore Leonard has these characters that are, you think they're just despicable, but no, they aren't, because they're funny, or they do something good. It's what Madison's talking about. I found a lot of bad in Dave White and a lot of really hilarious, wonderful things, and that made it easier for me.
The library closes in 20 minutes.
What was really
If you have
interesting.
those other materials that need to be checked out or need to register for a library card, please make your way to the return desk on the first floor.
Some of the stuff about my grandfather I didn't know when we got into the story. I did not know, for example, that my grandfather and his good buddy, J.J. Jackson, were the two people who shot and killed two of the black prisoners who had been arrested in 1946 in what was termed as one of the nation's first race riots. And I actually discovered this in court documents where I had a grand jury testimony. I had to get the grand jury testimony. It's where we learned this, that he was the shooter. He and Dave White were the shooter.
If you're going to say that, I think you got to say, in fairness, that the guys that got shot were armed and firing.
Well, here's the key. There were three guys in the room, all armed and all shooting at the cops. And they had somehow gotten ammunition and weapons from a stash that wasn't being protected, and they began to fire. There was a line of highway patrolmen in a hallway, and they had checked their guns at the beginning because they were going to dinner and they didn't want to take the guns into the jail, so all the guns were back on the table outside the bars. And so when these people started firing at the cops, they started passing guns up to the front of the line, and the two people in the front of the line were my grandfather and Jackson. And according to what I could find, my grandfather shot both these guys. But there was a third man in the room, third prisoner, who threw down his weapon and put his hands up, and they quit firing at him. And he testified to the grand jury that he and his friends shot first. So it wasn't a murder. it was a response to. But we didn't know this. I didn't know this at all until I got into the story. By this time, too long. I can't quit writing a book because I found out my grandfather killed somebody, and the grand jury ended up clearing them of murder. But even that I cast in a doubtful, because in those days, the boss Crump was running damn near everything in Tennessee, including Memphis, including most of the things in Memphis, and the FBI was headquartered in Memphis. But so I'm sure there are political decisions made about what the grand jury was ultimately going to report. And that skepticism and doubt is in the book.
And it's a very good book, and so is Madison's. Thank the library. Thank you all for coming. We're going to do this again on July 15th. Please put your email address down. Thank you very much for coming.